Chapter 3. Brick, Sorrel Top, and Ready. "What's up?" Joe asked as he joined Fred and Charlie.
"Kites,"
Charlie answered.
"Come on, we're tired out waiting for you."
The three set off down the street to the brow of the hill, where they looked down upon Union Street, far below and almost under their feet. This they called the Pit, and it was well named. Themselves they called the Hill Dwellers, and a descent into the Pit by the Hill Dwellers was looked upon by them as a great adventure. Scientific kite flying was one of the keenest pleasures of these three particular Hill Dwellers, and 6 or 8 kites strung out on a mile of twine and soaring into the clouds was an ordinary achievement for them. They were compelled to replenish their kite supply often, for whenever an accident occurred and the string broke, or a ducking kite dragged down the rest, or the wind suddenly died out, their kites fell into the Pit, from which place they were unrecoverable. The reason for this was that the young people of the Pit were a piratical and robber race with peculiar ideas of ownership and property rights. On a day following an accident to a kite of one of the Hill Dwellers, the self-same kite could be seen riding the air attached to a string which led down into the Pit to the lairs of the Pit people. So it came about that the Pit people, who were a poor folk and unable to afford scientific kite flying, developed great proficiency in the art when their neighbors, the Hill Dwellers, took it up. There was also an old sailorman who profited by this recreation of the Hill Dwellers, for he was learned in sails and air currents, and being deft of hand and cunning, he fashioned the best flying kites that could be obtained. He lived in a rattletrap shanty close to the water, where he could still watch with dim eyes the ebb and flow of the tide and the ships pass in and out, and where he could revive old memories of the days when he, too, went down to the sea in ships. To reach his shanty from the hill one had to pass through the Pit, and thither the three boys were bound. They had often gone for kites in the daytime, but this was their first trip after dark, and they felt it to be, as it indeed was, a hazardous adventure. In simple words, the Pit was merely the cramped and narrow quarters of the poor, where many nationalities crowded together in cosmopolitan confusion, and lived as best they could amid much dirt and squalor. It was still early evening when the boys passed through on their way to the sailorman's shanty, and no mishap befell them, though some of the Pit boys stared at them savagely and hurled a taunting remark after them now and then. The sailorman made kites which were not only splendid flyers, but which folded up and were very convenient to carry. Each of the boys bought a few, and with them wrapped in compact bundles and under their arms, started back on the return journey.
"Keep a sharp lookout for the boys," the kite maker cautioned them. "They like to be cruising around after dark." "We're not afraid," Charlie assured him, "and we know how to take care of ourselves."
Used to the broad and quiet streets of the hill, the boys were shocked and stunned by the life that teemed in the close-packed quarter. It seemed some thick and monstrous growth of vegetation, and they were wading through it. They shrank close together in the tangle of narrow streets, as though for protection, conscious of the strangeness of it all and how unrelated they were to it. Children and babies sprawled on the sidewalk and under their feet. Bareheaded and unkempt women gossiped in the doorways or passed back and forth with scant marketings in their arms. There was a general odor of decaying fruit and fish, a smell of staleness and putridity. Big hulking men slouched by, and ragged little girls walked gingerly through the confusion with foaming buckets of beer in their hands. There was a clatter and garble of foreign tongues and brogues, shrill cries, quarrels and wrangles, and the Pit pulsed with a great and steady murmur, like the hum of the human hive that it was.
"She's, I'll be glad when we're out of here,"
Fred said. He spoke in a whisper, and Joe and Charlie nodded grimly that they agreed with him. They were not inclined to speech, and they walked as rapidly as the crowd permitted, with much the same feelings as those of travelers in a dangerous and hostile jungle. And danger and hostility stalked in the Pit. The inhabitants seemed to resent the presence of these strangers from the hill. Dirty little urchins abused them as they passed, snarling with assumed bravery and prepared to run away at the first sign of attack. And still other little urchins formed a noisy parade at the heels of the boys, and grew bolder with increasing numbers. "Don't mind them," Joe cautioned. "Take no notice, but keep right on. We'll soon be out of it."
"No, we're in for it,"
said Fred in an undertone.
"Look there."
On the corner they were approaching, 4 or 5 boys of about their own age were standing. The light from a street lamp fell upon them and disclosed one with vivid red hair. It could be no other than Brick Simpson, the redoubtable leader of a redoubtable gang. Twice within their memory he had led his gang up the hill and spread panic and terror among the hill-dwelling young folk, who fled wildly to their homes, while their fathers and mothers hurriedly telephoned for the police. At sight of the group on the corner, the rabble at the heels of the 3 boys melted away on the instant with like manifestations of fear. This but increased the anxiety of the boys, though they held boldly on their way. The red-haired boy detached himself from the group and stepped before them, blocking their path. They essayed to go around him, but he stretched out his arm.
"What you doing here?"
he snarled.
"Why don't you stay where you belong?" "We're just going home,"
Fred said mildly. Brick looked at Joe.
"What you got under your arm?"
he demanded. Joe contained himself and took no heed of him. "Come on," he said to Fred and Charlie, at the same time starting to brush past the gang leader. But with a quick blow, Brick Simpson struck him in the face, and with equal quickness snatched the bundle of kites from under his arm. Joe uttered an inarticulate cry of rage, and, all caution flung to the winds, sprang at his assailant. This was evidently a surprise to the gang leader, who expected least of all to be attacked in his own territory. He retreated backwards, still clutching the kites, and divided between desire to fight and desire to retain his capture. The latter desire dominated him, and he turned and fled swiftly down the narrow side street into a labyrinth of streets and alleys. Joe knew that he was plunging into the wilderness of the enemy's country, but his sense of both property and pride had been offended, and he took up the pursuit hot-footed. Fred and Charlie followed after, though he outdistanced them, and behind came the 3 other members of the gang, emitting a whistling call while they ran, which was evidently intended for the assembling of the rest of the gang. As the chase proceeded, these whistles were answered from many different directions, and soon a score of dark figures were tagging at the heels of Fred and Charlie, who, in turn, were straining every muscle to keep the swifter-footed Joe in sight. Brick Simpson darted into a vacant lot, aiming for a slip, as such things are called, which are prearranged passages through fences and over sheds and houses and around dark holes and corners, where the unfamiliar pursuer must go more carefully and where the chances are many that he will soon lose the track. But Joe caught Brick before he could attain his end, and together they rolled over and over in the dirt, locked in each other's arms. By the time Fred and Charlie and the gang had come up, they were on their feet, facing each other.
"What do you want, eh?"
the red-headed gang leader was saying in a bullying tone.
"What do you want? That's what I want to know."
"I want my kites," Joe answered. Brick Simpson's eyes sparkled at the intelligence. Kites were something he stood in need of himself.
"Then you gotta fight for 'em," he announced.
"Why should I fight for them?" Joe demanded indignantly. "They're mine," which went to show how ignorant he was of the ideas of ownership and property rights which obtained among the people of the Pit. A chorus of jeers and catcalls went up from the gang, which clustered behind its leader like a pack of wolves. "Why should I fight for them?" Joe reiterated.
"'Cause I say so," Simpson replied, "and what I say goes, understand?"
But Joe did not understand. He refused to understand that Brick Simpson's word was law in San Francisco or any part of San Francisco. His love of honesty and right dealing was offended, and all his fighting blood was up. You give those kites to me right here and now, he threatened, reaching out his hand for them. But Simpson jerked them away.
Do you know who I am? He demanded. I'm Brick Simpson, and I don't allow no one talk to me in that tone voice.
Better leave him alone, Charlie whispered in Joe's ear.
What are a few kites? Leave him alone and let's get out of this.
They're my kites, Joe said slowly in a dogged manner. They're my kites, and I'm going to have them.
You can't fight the crowd, Fred interfered. And if you do get the best of him, they'll all pile on you.
The gang, observing this whispered colloquy and mistaking it for hesitancy on the part of Joe, set up its wolf-like howling again.
Afraid, afraid, the young roughs jeered and taunted. He's too high-toned, he is. Maybe he'll spoil his nice clean shirt. Then what'll Mama say? Shut up,
their leaders snapped authoritatively, and the noise obediently died away. Will you give me those kites? Joe demanded, advancing determinedly.
Will you fight for them?
Was Simpson's counter-demand. Yes, Joe answered.
Fight! Fight!
The gang began to howl again. And it's me that'll see fair play, said a man's heavy voice. All eyes were instantly turned upon the man who had approached unseen and made this announcement. By the electric light shining brightly on them from the corner, they made him out to be a big, muscular fellow, clad in a working man's garments. His feet were encased in heavy brogans, a narrow strap of black leather held his overalls about his waist, and a black and greasy cap was on his head. His face was grimed with coal dust, and a coarse blue shirt, open at the neck, revealed a wide throat and a massive chest.
And who are you?
Simpson snarled, angry at the interruption. None of your business, the newcomer retorted tartly. But if it'll do you any good, I'm a fireman on the China steamers, and as I said, I'm going to see fair play. That's my business. Your business is to give fair play. So pitch in and don't be all night about it. The three boys were as pleased by the appearance of the fireman as Simpson and his followers were displeased. They conferred together for several minutes, then Simpson deposited the bundle of kites in the arms of one of his gang and stepped forward.
Come on, then,
he said, at the same time pulling off his coat. Joe handed his to Fred and sprang toward Brick. They put up their fists and faced each other. Almost instantly, Simpson drove in a fierce blow and ducked cleverly away and out of reach of the blow which Joe returned. Joe felt a sudden respect for the abilities of his antagonist, but the only effect upon him was to arouse all the doggedness of his nature and make him utterly determined to win. Awed by the presence of the fireman, Simpson's followers confined themselves to cheering Brick and jeering Joe. The two boys circled round and round, attacking, feinting, and guarding, and now one and then the other getting in a telling blow. Their positions were in marked contrast. Joe stood erect, planted solidly on his feet, with legs wide apart and head up. On the other hand, Simpson crouched till his head was nearly lost between his shoulders, and all the while he was in constant motion, leaping and springing and maneuvering in the execution of a score or more of tricks quite new and strange to Joe. At the end of a quarter of an hour, both were very tired, though Joe was much fresher. Tobacco, ill food, and unhealthy living were telling on the gang leader, who was panting and sobbing for breath. Though at first, and because of superior skill, he had severely punished Joe, he was now weak and his blows were without force. Growing desperate, he adopted what might be called not an unfair but a mean method of attack. He would maneuver, leap in and strike swiftly, and then, ducking forward, fall to the ground at Joe's feet. Joe could not strike him while he was down, and so would step back until he could get on his feet again, when the thing would be repeated. But Joe grew tired of this and prepared for him. Timing his blow with Simpson's attack, he delivered it just as Simpson was ducking forward to fall. Simpson fell, but he fell over on one side, whither he had been driven by the impact of Joe's fist upon his head. He rolled over and got halfway to his feet, where he remained, crying and gasping. His followers called upon him to get up, and he tried once or twice, but was too exhausted and stunned.
"I give in," he said. "I'm licked."
The gang had become silent and depressed at its leader's defeat. Joe stepped forward. "I'll trouble you for those kites," he said to the boy who was holding them.
"Oh, I don't know," said another member of the gang, shoving in between Joe and his property.
His hair was also a vivid red.
"You got to lick me before you can have them."
"I don't see that," Joe said bluntly. "I've fought and I've won, and there's nothing more to it."
"Oh, yes, he is," said the other. "I'm Sorrel Top Simpson. Brick's my brother, see?"
And so, in this fashion, Joe learned another custom of the Pit people, of which he had been ignorant. "All right," he said, his fighting blood more fully aroused than ever by the unjustness of the proceeding. "Come on." Sorrel Top Simpson, a year younger than his brother, proved to be a most unfair fighter, and the good-natured fireman was compelled to interfere several times before the second of the Simpson clan lay on the ground and acknowledged defeat. This time Joe reached for his kites without the slightest doubt that he was to get them. But still another lad stepped in between him and his property. The telltale hair, vividly red, sprouted likewise on this lad's head, and Joe knew him at once for what he was, another member of the Simpson clan. He was a younger edition of his brothers, somewhat less heavily built, with a face covered with a vast quantity of freckles, which showed plainly under the electric light.
"You ain't get them there kites till you get me," he challenged in a piping little voice. "I'm Reddy Simpson, and you ain't licked the family till you've licked me."
The gang cheered admiringly, and Reddy stripped a tattered jacket preparatory for the fray.
"Get ready," he said to Joe.
Joe's knuckles were torn, his nose was bleeding, his lip was cut and swollen, while his shirt had been ripped down from throat to waist. Further, he was tired and breathing hard. "How many more are there of you Simpsons?" he asked. "I've got to get home, and if your family's much larger, this thing's liable to keep on all night."
"I'm the last and the best,"
Reddy replied.
"You gets me, and you gets a kite, sure."
"All right," Joe sighed. "Come on." While the youngest of the clan lacked the strength and skill of his elders, he made up for it by a wildcat manner of fighting that taxed Joe severely. Time and again it seemed to him that he must give in to the little whirlwind, but each time he pulled himself together and went doggedly on. For he felt that he was fighting for principle, as his forefathers had fought for principle. Also, it seemed to him that the honor of the Hill was at stake, and that he, as its representative, could do nothing less than his very best. So he held on and managed to endure his opponent's swift and continuous rushes till that young and less experienced person at last wore himself out with his own exertions, and from the ground confessed that, for the first time in its history,
the Simpson family was beat.
End of chapter 3.